Hey guys, my name is Bryce, and today I'll be doing a video of my mock of Tuma in probably the biggest form that you guys have seen of any mocks that I've done so far. I'm doing this one because, for one, it's probably one of the largest mocks that I've done, and two, I just wanted to go over this before I put it either into storage or potentially have it go up for sale or something like that, because it's got a lot of specialty pieces, which I really love the design of this, but unfortunately it's not something I see a lot of these pieces going into use for sort of further projects and things like that, since so many sets are going into CCBS. I also wanted to tell the story of this one a bit, since there's a bit more of a narrative to it, and I just think the character itself is interesting, both in the original form and how I sort of modified the actual design. And as you can see, for starters, the wings are huge and very imposing, and the creature itself is both one that's kind of this massive hulking behemoth, but also has a lot of flexibility in what I designed, and also is quite posable, so I'll sort of go into details for that. Now, to sort of work our way from top to bottom, essentially these wings are all comprised of moving pieces that are all connected into each other, and they can sort of fold flat, but they can also be positioned for a number of different sort of patterns of feathering, essentially, or you can just sort of have it as chaotic as you like. But the general idea behind this is to actually, give a decent wingspan given how massive this character is, and in itself it's no small feat. But the nice thing is that while it's very dramatic in this pose, you can actually sort of tuck the wings away when Tuma's in battle or is just sort of walking around and things like that. And even though it's a bit of a balance issue, Tuma is actually quite posable thanks to his massive feet. But I'll get to those in a minute though. So going down to the shoulders now, these two sort of Borak shoulder pieces are entirely posable as well, and that's important because when you're actually moving the arm up and down, the shoulder itself actually moves accordingly. It's kind of based on all these different ball joints that are connected, and everything sort of shifts, so these sort of fold down, and everything's pretty much symmetrical from here on down aside from weapons, just to keep everything balanced, and also just it makes more sense that this is a sort of general tactician, and he's sort of ornate, but primarily is just kind of built for battle and running around and flying and a bunch of action things that can't really be too off kilter one way or another. So now that the wings are put back, I can zoom in almost to like a regular size backdrop, because most of the other sets are a little bit shorter than this even, but even so, this is Tuma crouching. This is not at full height. But moving down though, LEGO used to have this game where kids would essentially launch these little blasters at each other, and what would happen is that if you ended up hitting the other sort of opponent toy, you would take one of the life dials and sort of spin it down, and all the way until you lose essentially, and then just sort of restart it again for a new game. But because this character is so massive, it sort of has more health points somehow, if you can equate it to that. But that's sort of why they're on both sides that way. There's this huge medallion that I have sort of hanging from his chest, and that sort of absorbs a lot of damage, but you can tell that the sort of metal breastplate underneath is what actually offers protection, and everything else is fairly moderately armored. The hard thing for this is always, in my designs, for some reason I have a really slim waist, so I added these sort of fins to act as potential guards, but also just add a bit more mass. Moving further down, there's a lot of flexibility in the thighs, which you wouldn't consider to be important, but the fact that kicking poses and everything can be all done by this character means that there's a lot of potential for just playability and posing for Tuma. As well, in the ankles, I consider it really important that feet could be sort of in a back position, or also be kind of double jointed in a number of different ways based on sort of this piece and this piece sort of interacting. And the main thing is just adding friction too, to make sure that this actually quite heavy piece of plastic would be able to stay upright even on one foot, and even with sort of cantilevered weapons and things like that. And speaking of which, I essentially developed these two swords that were kind of twinned, but also sort of serve different purposes as well. So starting with the smaller one, this is much more of like a sabre or rapier and things like that. It's a very quick sort of slashing sword sort of thing with, you know, a fairly decent guard. I like the idea of taking this bionicle tool, which was actually used to be sort of pulled out of a little gearbox that would actually send little spinners flying due to these teeth sort of connecting in and being able to activate it, and actually use it as a, you know, kind of separate out of context piece for something totally different. And moving on to the other side, much like most right-handed weapons in Bionicle, this is a larger one and more imposing, but just as important as the other one, where this one sort of does more quick attacks. This one definitely does the majority of the heavy hitting, like the most damage essentially, and you know, there's a much more developed guard, and it's much more pronounced with, you know, spikes and things like that, and there's also the launcher sort of built into it, so essentially the Tuma doesn't have to switch weapons in order to sort of go from, you know, close quarters combat to something that's far off. He just sort of, you know, extends his arm, aims generally from the hip, and then lets this fly. And that's been most of the front side, but as for the back side, I tried to sort of keep everything, you know, fairly well covered as well. Just moving the wings out of the way for a minute, you can sort of tell with the back that there are these two sort of sidearms essentially, which I have. One is able to launch discs, and the other is like a sort of older tool from Voyanui, and these I wanted to sort of have as like a nod to earlier Bionicle, but also, you know, make sure that just sort of sitting at his hip, they don't kind of seem all that strange or alien, basically. They're, in case he ends up having to use just different tools, basically. Now for the rest of the back, the legs have pretty ample coverage and things like that, and where the wings are, it was very difficult to sort of both make sure that this was securely attached, but also have enough room for flexibility and things like that. I wanted to make sure Tuma's throat wasn't very exposed, so I added metal plating and things like that, and kind of gave him a bit of a hunch, and that sort of transitions into where the wings begin. So sort of both of these arm/wing pieces are very flexible, and they still carry a fair bit of friction, which is pretty important for being able to pose these and kind of keep them in a flight-like position. And the nice thing too is that his head can be positioned looking fairly straight up and everything. Imagining flight is quite possible. And that sums it up for my Tuma MOC. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.